Hello and welcome to episode 514 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paridon, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. With me, as always, is my co-host, fantastic historian and good buddy, John Parshall. How are you today, John?
I'm doing great. Lovely to be here.
We have a new guest with us today. As if you're
Yes.
watching, you can clearly tell, and most of you probably already know who he is, but I'm going to let John do the introduction there.
Yes, Justin Pike has done a lot of work with Christoph Berg out on his military aviation history channel, a really good YouTube channel. I would highly recommend anybody who's not familiar with them to go and check them out. And it was actually a viewer of both this channel and that channel that turned me on to Justin. It was like, did you know this guy? And I'm like, no, man, no. And went out and watched him like, whoa, who is this guy? So we're delighted to have Justin with us today to explore the China Air War, which is an oft neglected topic within the broader Asia Pacific War. And yes, we're just going to kind of go through a brief overview, brief in the way that we do it, right? An hour and a half
Exactly.
or something like that, talking about the events from 1937 into 1941.
Yeah. And to that end, I'll read our brief little pithy intro that we have here. So, as John was saying earlier this season, we've covered a lot of the war in China. Obviously, not all of it, but most of the very high points, going back to Mukden, Marco Polo. We dove into the battles for Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan,
Yep.
and all points in between. And while these were massively important for the Chinese and obviously the Japanese as well, but they were important to the world as a whole. And I think that's a great misunderstanding in Western minds, even to this day. And that's one of the reasons that we did what we did. But there was one aspect, of course, that we did not cover, which John was mentioning, and that is the air war over China. And we did that purposely because we were waiting for this gentleman to
Justin.
join us here today. So, like you said, it was viewed mainly, John, by a lot of Westerners as not being important, but it was hugely important
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
IJN specifically, more than
Right.
anybody else.
Yeah, because when you fast forward to some of the earlier battles in 42, I mean, you look at a guy like Tominaga, who's the air group leader on Hiryu, and this is a cat who had experience in China, and a lot of the carrier aviators within Kitabutai and their land-based air units as well had experience from China, and I think that it affected them in both positively and negatively, I guess I would say. So
Yeah.
just kind of kicking off in 37, one of the things that I was surprised to read, and we should do our obligatory plug here for, there's not a lot in English on the China Air War, and this was Mark Peaty's Sunburst was one of the first books that actually did has some fairly substantial content. There's a whole chapter in there on attacking a continent, and then also Rich Frank's Tower of Skulls has info on this as well. But one of the things that just kind of knocked me back when I went back and reread this was that when the fighting kicks off in 1937, the Imperial Army sort of sees northern China as their sphere of operations, whereas the Navy is looking at southern China, particularly around Shanghai, as being their bailiwick. And yet at the same time, um, the Army is looking to the Navy to be supplying aircraft to actually help the Japanese Army in their ground operations. In fact, there's this quote here from a general named Iwane that IJA air support was worthless and that the Navy was much better at it, which I was just blown away by because we don't generally think of the IJN as being ground support specialists. But Justin, any comments on that?
Yeah, and I mean, it's the reason why we don't think of that is because they really weren't. So I found that very interesting as well because, and I've talked about this with another contact of mine who's an expert on Japanese aviation, and I confirmed with him that yeah, like pre-war in China, the Japanese Navy didn't have any training really related to supporting ground forces. They
Right.
had a little bit of scattered limited experience. I mean, 1932 Shanghai, um, but doctrinally speaking, they didn't really have much in place. Um, the little bit I can add is they had at least thought out some kind of communications with ground forces, very rudimentary. I read a report that had gotten their hands on some of these guides and that had been translated, and colored smoke and different things you can lay out on the ground to indicate where the enemy is or where friendly forces are. Very rudimentary cooperation like that. I don't know how much that improved beyond 37 because I really haven't seen anything beyond that.
Yeah,
But there was at least a little bit in place to try and coordinate. Um, I know on the army side of things, it's funny because they do emphasize coordination with the forces. That's kind of one of their main
sure.
jobs.
You would think.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny that like their own the army is dragging itself basically
Right, right.
over it. Um, yeah, that's as much as I have to
That's
contribute there.
that's kind of funny. So, and just to kind of level set for folks where we are in terms of airframes in 1937, on the Navy side of things, they're mostly still flying biplane level attack and torpedo bombers that are being used for level attack. Is the G3M out yet?
Yes,
Yes.
it's the new shiny toy, state of the art pretty much at the beginning of the war.
Right.
Um, And yeah, pretty much everything else in the Navy inventory is older. I'm racking my brain. Like there were a handful of A5Ms kicking around, but very
Right. The
few.
F5M Claude
Um,
fighter. Yep.
yeah, but they were still rocking a lot of E2Ns, A4Ns,
Which are
B,
biplanes.
yeah,
Yep.
B4Y, D1A. I'm trying to remember all these short designations.
And I've
Uh,
got fancy, I got some pictures of these we can throw up on the screen too.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so the G3M Nell is the predecessor to the Betty
G4M.
that's going
Yeah.
to come out in a few years. So this is a bi-engine monocoque, you know, bomber that's
Twin
got a
tail.
fairly decent payload and a fairly good range. The A5M Claude is going to be introduced, so that's just brand new as well. It sounds like
Yeah,
that
it's just
too is
starting
a
to squeak
monoplane,
in. Yeah.
right? So, so then what's on the Imperial Army side of the inventory? Because I'm completely clueless about that.
Yeah, so just a scattering of examples. They did have the Key 10, which was a respectable biplane fighter.
Okay,
Again, still a biplane. They also had on the bomber side, they were actually in real bad shape. They had the Key 1 and the Key 2, which were both they were both monoplane bombers, but from the early 1930s.
okay,
So they were very old, really, by the start of the war, but they were still using them heavily. In fact, there's a little bit of they have that's why they turned to. So I guess I don't know how many people know this, but the reason why the army ends up buying BR-20s from the Italians is as a stopgap, because they're waiting on the Key 21, the Type 97,
okay.
um, to
Which is
enter
another
service.
dual engine bomber,
Yeah.
roughly comparable to the Nell, I guess I would say. It's got a little
Yeah.
heavier payload though, doesn't it?
Yeah, like an extra 200 kilograms on paper. It's basically like so the G3M is new and very new in 37. That the Key 21 isn't on the scene yet. That comes in a little bit later. I think the very first ones to start squeaking into service in very late 37, if memory serves.
Hmm.
And then they start trickling in more and more through 38 and beyond. Um, and then of course the G4M comes in the latest.
Right.
So that's kind of the hierarchy of generations within those three bombers. And then there's the BR-20 kind of awkwardly in between the really old stuff and before the Key 21 really comes onto the scene. And the Japanese generally don't like it, at least from anything I've read.
So they're flying
Um,
Italian bombers in China.
yeah, yeah,
That's
a
correct.
handful, and they see you even see action at Nomonhan as well.
Okay.
Um, and they were generally not regarded well from anything I've read.
Hmm.
With one qualification that I know there's a very new book out through Ottawasi that I haven't gotten my hands on that is specifically about the BR-20 and Key 21 in Japanese Army service. And there
Okay,
might be more in there that adds nuance. But anything I've read, it's largely just like, oh yeah, these things aren't that great. We like our Key 21s better.
interesting.
Um,
So, who has more aircraft in the theater at this point, Army or Navy? Do we
uh,
have a sense for that?
yes, so, and I do have those numbers.
Here I am,
Let's see
like
if I can find them.
pop quiz,
Yeah, you're throwing boomerangs out there.
ding the
Um,
guest. Do you have those
yeah,
numbers?
so overall, the Japanese Navy Air Service has more aircraft, at least frontline like aircraft. Like so, the Japanese Army Air Service. These are Mitsuru's numbers from the Battle for China. That chapter in there. 520 operational aircraft for the Japanese Army Air Service, but they had over 1,000 aircraft total, so probably including trainers and other stuff.
Okay.
Japanese Navy Air Service, 600 aircraft, including about 800 reserves, is what they give for 37.
Wow.
And for available for China in the initial operations, there's about 200 Army aircraft and about 128 Navy aircraft. Again,
Okay.
those are Mitsuru's numbers. When it comes to numbers in the air war in China, every book you check is probably have a different
It's
number.
different. Yeah.
Um, Particularly on the Chinese side, which I guess maybe I can
Yeah.
actually take some time to
Devastates.
explain what they're fighting.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess the first thing to note is China was not a fully unified nation state at this
Right.
time. So it
Yeah.
instead consisted of numerous factions who were at least nominally under the control of the central government, the KMT. The degree to which they were under control varied different points in time. Related to air power, it's worth noting that the Guangxi Provincial Air Force in southern China actually was sizable. Um,
Okay. So you've got
and
warlords with planes, is kind of
You've
what it
got
comes to.
warlords with planes.
Right.
And right shortly before the war, the outset of the war in 37, there's an incident where a large portion of this provincial air force defects to the Central Air Force. So what we'll
Okay.
probably call the CAF or Chinese Air Force. Sometimes we see it as Central Air Force as well. Um, there's a lot of conspiracies about this. It's like, did the KMT pay them all off or anything? It's from the historian I've read, their argument is it's probably more grassroots. They were gung ho to fight the Japan as
Hmm.
tensions were ramping up, and because these defections were literally like pilots hopping into their planes and just flying to the to,
Oh,
to
my.
KMT
Okay.
airfields.
Right.
So they've been amalgamated, but it's kind of interesting because you've got this Chinese Air Force that only a handful of months before the outbreak of hostilities had just absorbed another Air Force, basically,
Okay.
into it.
It's
Um,
not it's not any different than on the ground either, for that matter. Same
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing happens on the ground.
exactly. And of course, there's like relatively famous anecdotes, during the Battle of Shanghai, where you couldn't move different military units around without issuing orders in the names of their warlords, because they weren't
Right.
going to listen to anybody else,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Um, So with the Chinese Air Force, the Central Air Force, um, its origins kind of go back into the late 1920s, in its kind of infancy, and then with the help of an American aviation mission under I think John Jewett, from 32 to 35, 1932 to 35, that set the real foundation for a modern Air Force. In fact, in 1933, on the advice of John Jewett, they established an independent Air Force, so they separated
Okay.
it from
Okay.
the Army. Um, and also it controlled anti-aircraft artillery as well, so very much like the
Okay.
Luftwaffe in
Yeah.
that regard.
Right. Right.
And they also helped establish an aviation school, laid a lot of that early groundwork. They set up an aircraft factory as well. This American mission was replaced by an Italian mission in 1935. Um,
Interesting.
so the Americans still worked in various capacities as advisors. So there's a lot of overlap here. The Italian mission is almost universally derided. I have never seen somebody say a nice thing about it. The nicest thing I have seen a source say was they were cheaper than the Americans, um, which is yeah,
Damned by faint praise, right?
yeah. Like normally, if it was because obviously the Americans might have a vested interest in poo-pooing this mission that kind of
Sure.
supplanted them.
Yeah.
But even the Chinese were like
Pretty
not
rinky-dink.
impressed. And you can see
Interesting.
through their procurement and things that the Italians, there's a very brief period where they start buying some Italian stuff and then they pretty much go right back to American dominated procurement very
Okay.
quickly. Um, So, and the mission, the Italian mission leaves at the outset of hostilities in
Okay.
37, under Japanese pressure. Um,
Got it.
so another thing to note with the Chinese Air Force, and this is actually quite new scholarship from Kwang Chi-man in a journal article from only a handful of years ago, where he actually looks at what the Chinese were thinking about air power. And there were pre-war debates raging in China about what this Chinese Air Force was going to do. So there
Yeah.
was, of course, these we're going to support the army primarily via fighters versus strategic bombing and targeting of warships,
Right.
which always surprised me initially because I'd always assumed just for years and years they would have more realistic appreciation of their limitations. But no, they were very, very their heads were in the clouds because what ultimately wins out in this initial period is strategic bombing and targeting the Japanese Navy.
Wow.
So they have pre-war planning where they are going to be sinking the Japanese Navy off the coast. They are going to be set eventually later in the war setting fire to Tokyo. Um,
That's
they
ambitious.
they're very
Yeah.
ambitious. So they really did like Duhay's air power theory, which they
Sure.
ironically they get via the Japanese. So particularly a lot of those provincial air force, they trained with the Japanese earlier in the 1930s. Duhay's
Mhm.
translated into Japanese in 1934, if I recall
Okay.
correctly, and that's how they get it. So they get it via Japan, and it
Fascinating.
really gets into
Right.
their heads. So anyway, the end result is by the time of mid 1937, the Chinese Air Force had, again, with these numbers, you'll get widely varying ones, but we'll go with about 600 aircraft total.
Yeah.
Roughly 250 of those operational. To talk about variance, I've seen numbers as high as 900. Um, you know, we're so there's a lot of error here, but
Yeah.
what may come as a surprise to people is that roughly two-thirds of the total strength were light and heavy bombers.
Oh, wow.
Hmm.
Because again, they'd really believed in the strength of the bomber. They were going to be
Yeah.
sinking the Navy. They were going to be doing all that kind of stuff.
So
Um,
just to sort of level set for our viewers who some of whom probably are not familiar with pre-war air theorists. You got
Hmm.
Giulio Douhet, who's sort of
Hmm.
lockstep. He's Italian, and he's kind of lockstep with Hugh Trenchard in the RAF. These are both people who are just completely focused on this whole notion of the bomber will always get through and terror
Hmm.
bombing against cities is going to crack enemy morale and air forces will be able to win wars entirely on their own without the participation of the other services.
And
And
that
so, yeah, if you drink that Kool-Aid, you end up with sort of interesting looking force compositions.
and everybody at that, and it's important to note that not everybody, but most everybody at that time was drinking that Kool-Aid.
Yeah,
Billy Mitchell, for crying out loud, in the
for
United
sure.
States. So, I mean, this is all stemming from Duhé. If you look at those pre-war air forces for not just the RAF, but like you were saying, the Chinese, and to an extent later on, as we're going to talk about some of these Japanese bombing raids, transoceanic bombing raids, they're all centered around the heavy bomber or the medium bomber, as the case may be for this one in particular.
Which was the heavy bomber of the time.
Which, right, for them, yeah, for sure. And then, I mean, everything. So, and we can talk about this later if we want to, about the whole fighter or bomber always gets through theory, which is, of course, proven time and time and time again to be completely ludicrous.
Yeah.
And it's comical. If it would be comical if it wasn't so damn sad. But the point is that everybody was building their air forces along these very
Along these
same lines.
lines.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So they're no different
Particularly
than anybody
because
else.
Well, and the other thing that's going on here too is in the mid 1930s, in many cases, the performance characteristics of multi-engine bombers were superior to single-engine fighters. They were
Yeah.
faster, they could fly higher, and so it seemed reasonable at the time to suppose that the bomber would always get through. But what ends up happening, of course, is that in the 30s, particularly the late 30s, engine power increases dramatically, and so all of a sudden these single-engine fighters now begin to catch up to the bombers in terms of performance and exceed them. So I'm just from a sheer fiscal standpoint, though, the notion of a very poor country like China investing most of its extremely limited Air Force capital into more expensive bombers, that's a real eye opener. I had no idea about that.
Yeah, and I just actually popped into the chat for our benefit as well, the just a table that I pulled out of Kwang Chiman's article here for the initial force composition, and you can see
Cool.
they have some fighters, and then they have an awful lot of light and medium bombers.
Right.
Most of the aircraft are American. There's a handful of Italian in there. There's even some Heinkel 111s, courtesy of, I think they were initially from the Provincial Air Force in the South. Um,
Courtesy of when their pilots defected to.
yeah.
Yeah, right.
Um, yeah. And there's a lot of bombers there.
Yeah,
And Kwang Chiman attributes, so as we're going to find out very shortly here, it does not go well for the Chinese initially in the war.
yeah.
And he attributes a lot of that to this unrealistic expectation. So he outlines a pre-war plan from 1935 for the Chinese Air Force that they're going to phase one, they're going to destroy Japanese naval units along the Yangtze. Then they're going to destroy the Japanese beachhead at Shanghai. Then the Japanese fleet approaching the Chinese coast, and then start bombing Sasebo. Is
Okay.
the initial plans.
And Seth and I mentioned that briefly when we were covering the fighting in Shanghai, that the Chinese Air Force does show up and tries to
Yes,
initiate an attack against the Japanese Navy, and they are just wildly unsuccessful, end up bombing their own.
woefully inaccurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, hmm. Apparently, yeah, pre-war doctrine did not mate up necessarily with good training. Well, but that's a whole thing in and of itself. I'm sure that the Chinese Air Force does not have sufficient planes, nor pilots, nor gasoline to be doing a lot of training. Yeah.
Yeah, so their training is like, and I forgot to write down the actual figures. So they trained several hundred aircrew at the aviation school the Americans helped set up. Again, that ends largely in 35. There's obviously still echoes on from that, but then the Italians take over, and again, the Italians, generally speaking, they're characterized as being primarily concerned with getting export deals for their aircraft. And
Right.
their training was largely limited to this is exactly what you should do to bomb communists that have no defenses. And it was
Right.
very much focused on that, as opposed to kind of a broader education they were getting from the American mission.
Right.
So there were definitely shortcomings there. They were
Yeah.
doing their best, but yeah, there's definitely issues.
Yeah. It all comes
Um,
down to a lack of money.
yeah. There's just and not a whole lot of time, and there's an awful lot going on in China all the way up to this point as well. So of course, like we're starting with 37, but if there's I mean there's constant blowups with Japan.
Sure.
Before that, of course,
Yeah,
and then they're fighting
consistently.
various internal wars. Central Plains War. Uh, I always kind of find it funny because like on the Chinese history side, people talk about the Nanjing decade. And it's like, well, you're fighting multiple wars in this decade where they're nominally supposed to be running the country, but they're spending an awful lot of time of it putting down warlords still.
Right.
So it's like,
And the commies too. Right.
yeah,
Every
yeah.
so often. Yeah. Right.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Hmm.
Okay. So how do things go down? I guess I would say in
Hmm.
the initial blows. The
Yeah.
Marco Polo bridge incident kicks off, and what's happening overhead?
Yeah. So in North China, again, as you mentioned, primarily the domain of the army. On paper, the Navy did have the second combined air group assigned to the North China, but that was very quickly transferred to Central China because, frankly, there was barely anything to
To
do
do.
really
Yeah.
in North China other than helping the army rout kind of largely unreliable northern provincial forces and things like that. There were a handful of Chinese aircraft in the north. I don't really have figures, but we're talking probably I'd be shocked if it was more than 50.
Okay.
Um, and it was so much so that even though the Japanese Army Air Service, I don't know if we'll get into this, had a very strong emphasis on destruction of enemy air power doctrinally,
Hmm.
they explicitly were like, we're going to be pretty much straight up army support. We're not even going to really bother with trying to knock out aviation in North China that much initially because it's is that irrelevant.
Okay.
Um, and they basically do that. So they're bombing Chinese forces. They're doing a little bit of interdiction as well. So because the Chinese units start falling apart in North China quite quickly, it starts to become more the using air power to try and cut off lines of retreat,
Okay.
even more than any what we would call close air support, really.
Rail lines and bridges and that kind of thing.
Yeah, just bombing masses of Chinese troops that are trying to flee,
Nice.
basically.
Right.
Um, And this is in sharp contrast to what would end up blowing up, of course, starting in August in central China around Shanghai
Hmm.
with the Japanese Navy primarily. Again, there was I can't remember exactly when they bring it in, but Japanese Army starts to send some stuff in eventually as things intensify, but it's primarily a Navy job in central China.
Yeah.
Um, and that was where the vast majority of Chinese air strength was located. So these were the core regions that were really important for the KMT to control. They were the wealthiest, most industrial parts that were
Right.
under firm nationalist leadership. They had reasonable bases in the area and everything. And the Chinese, by choice, largely decided to make their stand in and around Shanghai,
Yep.
and that reflected in air as well.
Okay.
So, of course, the initial Chinese Air Force operations against Japanese warships in the Yangtze and near Shanghai, it failed spectacularly.
Right.
So there were, of course, the abortive attempts to bomb Izumo
Mhm.
because they'd originally been looking for the aircraft carriers. They couldn't find them.
Right.
So they opted to try and bomb Izumo, which was anchored
Command
off,
cruiser. Yeah.
yeah. And of course, infamously, August 14th, 1937, they tried to bomb it. The bombs fell into the Shanghai International Settlement
Right.
instead. And again, figures vary, but up to 1,000 civilians killed immediately, and then
Lord.
several thousand more wounded. It was a it was the casualties were astonishing because they hit a particular theater that had been kind of a collection point for various civilian refugees fleeing the other fighting. It's like it's a level of civilian casualties that like countries
Y-
trying to bomb civilians would fall short of. Like,
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things I'm in the middle of right now is editing this 1942 book, and you look at the efforts of RAF Bomber Command in early 1942, and in many cases they are losing more aviators killed in aircraft being shot down than they are managing to kill on the ground. I mean, there are raids where they'll go in with 100 aircraft, and the only casualties that they'll inflict will be one guy who was cut by flying glass because he happened to be outside his shelter at the wrong time. So to kill 1,000 people like that by mistake, I mean that's yikes.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's just a catastrophe. There's really no other way to
yeah,
describe it. And then really there were some abortive efforts to try and bomb Japanese positions in Shanghai itself. So in this initial stage, they're of course applying a lot of pressure on what are initially SNLF, the Shanghai SNLF,
right.
bottled up in Shanghai. They have a very the SNLF headquarters in Shanghai is very fortified. And then they've got lots of other concrete positions, or they're hiding out in buildings. And the Chinese really, their air power doesn't really do a whole lot to them.
Well, I just have to
Um,
think from a standpoint of target designation. Yeah, how do you even know what it is that you're attacking in a lot of cases,
yeah.
and or there had to have been friendly fire incidents as well, I would
Oh,
think.
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that were the
Yeah,
case as well. Basically, there's not a whole lot of detail, which also tends to indicate that it really wasn't doing a whole lot. Um, and of course, the Chinese very quickly in the air, they have more than they can handle just trying to even disrupt what the Japanese are doing.
right.
Um, So the Japanese Navy Air Service, they achieve air superiority over Nanjing for even further inland by like September 1937, roughly, with a combination of their operations, and then the Chinese were increasingly withdrawing their assets into the interior to defend Wuhan. And then overall, again, the CAF had lost basically their entire initial aircraft inventory by November 1937. They had common figures about 30 aircraft remaining by November 1937,
So
down
they've
from their
lost 500 plus planes or something like
yeah,
that.
something like that.
Right.
So the and in these initial battles, again, these abortive attempts to hit ships and then try to do some kind of attack against ground targets has largely failed. Where the Chinese at least do meet with some success, are shooting down primarily unescorted G3Ms
Yeah.
that the Japanese were using very aggressively, and also some of their carrier-based aircraft as well. So I guess one thing I didn't really mention is we talked about the initial aircraft that the Japanese are using, and the conception of the air war in China is usually that the Japanese always outmatch the Chinese technologically. But in this early period, a lot of aircraft categories, the Chinese are at the very least comparable in generation, or are actually using newer aircraft than the Japanese have available.
Okay.
And that's where you can the Japanese start running into problems, particularly with defending their G3Ms. They're high performance, but the Chinese do have fighters that can catch them. The Chinese, pretty consistently through this war, as we'll probably discuss, has a very effective early warning system. In
Right.
Mhm.
part help set up in part by Chenault, but the Chinese get a lot of credit too. And with that combination of that plus unescorted bombers, the G3Ms do tend to suffer quite heavily.
Right.
Um, but again, the Chinese are taking significant losses doing this as well, and really the whole effort falls apart once the Japanese start escorting their G3Ms with fighters.
But that
Um,
takes a while, right?
yeah,
And yeah, because at this point, I'm trying to the mainline Chinese fighter was Curtis
Curtis Hawk
Hawk.
3.
Curtis
Yeah,
Hawk, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Let's talk about these G3M bombing raids. That's something that we put in the notes, John, and it's
Yeah.
incredibly important because these are, for all intents and purposes, the first transoceanic raids conducted during the war. And this goes back to what we talked about in the beginning here, or relatively close to the beginning, about Duhé and about the overall strategic bombing theory that Japan was starting to adopt in China and the United States and everybody else. So these G3Ms as they're state of the art at this time, Justin, what is their range? Like how far can they what are their legs like? How far can they get out there and then get back? And in terms of fighter escort, what is the general, range, if you will? And then we can lead into, the losses sustained and all that other stuff too.
Right.
yeah. So I stupidly did not write down operational ranges for every aircraft. Um, so I know
Welcome to the
from
club.
memory, from
Neither
memory,
did we.
these initial raids, which were the longest of them, were operating pretty close to the limits. They had round trips of 1,850 kilometers roughly.
Mhm.
Right.
So chop that in half. Um,
Sure. Yeah.
for the
700,
G3Ms.
700 miles, something like that, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
So
no.
quite long ranged.
Well,
Yeah, I'm
the
trying to.
like we put in the notes in 37, their initial long range raids are coming. They're going, between 400 and 500 miles inland
Mm,
as these G3Ms are going through there,
Yeah.
which is, is like it says in Sunburst, and Rich says the same thing. This is astonishing to the people in the West, the United
mhm.
Yeah.
States, Great Britain, and everybody else. We're sitting there going, damn, we didn't think they could go that far. Number one, and number two, when they are going that far, for like we were alluding to, vast majority of these raids are unescorted, and these
Right.
guys are getting their plows cleaned. And and we can talk about the physical exertion of the pilots and the mental exertion of the pilots, because these are some long rides, 7, 8 hours on these birds, but
Yeah.
they're unescorted. They're getting hammered by AAA. They're getting hammered by Chinese fighters, and the losses are, I mean, they're going,
They're really bad.
they're
Yeah.
climbing.
The range of even of the Claude, I think, is only about 400 miles. Um, if. And so, yeah, there's no way that they're going to be able to go all the way to Chongqing and back or something like that. That's just not in the cards. Um,
No.
I would like to know more too, just about Chinese anti-aircraft, because they had to have had some guns from the Germans, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any 88s?
No 88. Well, I think they had a handful of the old naval 88s in fixed positions.
Okay.
Um, I know I have these numbers somewhere because I put
I'm
them.
sorry, man. Here we are just putting you on the spot, like with no preparation at all. It's like, can
It's
you
all
give us a
right.
detailed order of battle of their anti-aircraft forces?
Yeah, so from 39, okay, I'm gonna
Good. We've got Justin into real-time history mode. That
That's
is what
it.
we love to see. That's what we
That's
do
it.
here
Start
I
digging in.
know
on
I know where it is, at
Unauthorized.
least as an example for 39 in Chongqing, I know where the figures are.
Okay.
Let me just find them.
Oh,
We'll
yeah.
edit that.
I do want to talk about though, as Justin, as you're digging,
Mhm.
I do want to talk about the size of the Japanese bomber formations. And we can talk about, after we get through the AAA and all that stuff, how they're small, the formations are small, and then they get
Yeah.
bigger, and they don't have the conception of mutual defense locked in
Right.
like the Army Air Corps had, United States Army Air Corps had at that time. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
B-17 and obviously later
Really,
the Liberator and things like that. The whole box formation. Admittedly, that was developed, as a result of getting your asses kicked by the Luftwaffe, but still, this is something
yeah.
that the Japanese have no conception of
Well,
as
nobody had any.
evidence. Exactly, and
We're
that's my point is that
we're the
nobody
only Air
did.
Force that comes into a war with a doctrine along those lines. I mean, you look at RAF too. They had no notion of trying to self-protect and or establish any sort of air superiority over the Luftwaffe in order to carry out their bomber offensive.
Right. And that's what I
Um,
was saying. That's what I put in the notes is that if you cut out the Spanish Civil War,
right.
where the Germans are bombing, cities in Spain, obviously with their HE-111s and whatever. This is the first time this is really happening. And yeah,
Yeah.
you could say World War One, there was strategic bombing in World War One, and to a degree there was, but nothing like this.
Yeah.
Nothing like this. This is a sustained, or
Yeah.
it's the beginning of a sustained strategic
Campaign.
air campaign. And this is the
Yep.
first one in the war, really, honest to God. It really is.
Yeah.
And the lessons that, like I said, lessons learned in warfare are unfortunately always the hardest lessons to be learned.
Right.
And the Japanese are no different than anybody else.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have the numbers for 1939 Chongqing, which
Real
isn't
time
that.
history. Love it.
So there was and again 1939 Chongqing, which I guess for people who don't know that by that point had recently become the wartime capital for the
Nationalist
nationalists,
capital. Right.
deep in Sichuan province. Um, so there were 17 75 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, 8 37 millimeter, and then 8 20 to 25 millimeter cannons. And then a little later in that year, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the use of mobile anti-aircraft artillery that could be moved to different positions to
Right.
throw off incoming bombing raids. And then to assist in night targeting and signaling, they also had an array of searchlight batteries and sound ranging equipment. They had apparently about roughly 20 searchlight battery stations spread around Chongqing
Hmm.
and in the city proper, the South Bank, etc. Um, and they did pose a problem to the Japanese, as we could probably get into.
Yeah.
They forced primarily they forced formations to fly higher than they probably would have liked
Right.
um, to
Right.
try and stay safe. I
So
could tell you the
when does
exact
this
types.
campaign against Chongqing actually kick off?
The first raid is, I believe, February of 30. No, February
So
38.
38.
Yes,
So we
first
jump
bombing raid of Chongqing, February 1938. A single Chutai, 9 aircraft.
9.
And they
Yeah.
didn't bomb the city proper. They bombed an airfield just north of it.
Got it.
That was technically if you want to be technical, that would be when it starts. I guess to rapidly finish off 37 here.
Yeah. Let's do that. Sorry. Kind of
Yeah,
jumping
so
around here.
again, as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese Air Force, what's left of it, starts withdrawing back to Wuhan. So again, for people who are not super familiar with the war generally, initially the capital is Nanjing. This
Yep.
moves to Wuhan, then it moves to Chongqing after Wuhan's fall.
Right.
Um, so they start pulling back into the interior to try and fight a prolonged war of attrition. Um,
Which is exactly what the ground forces are in the process of doing as well.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Because the Japanese, they would absolutely love to destroy the Chinese military as close to the coast as they can,
Sure.
before they start running into logistics issues. Um, and yeah, the air power does basically the same thing. Now, as we mentioned, they're reduced to from their pre-war
Right. They got
inventory down to
nothing
like
left.
30 aircraft. So it's like,
Right.
where are they getting an air force from? Well, the Soviet Union
Okay.
is where they come in
Enter
huge.
Uncle Joe. Okay.
Yeah. So this is something that I really try to emphasize because it's just without the Soviet Union, there wouldn't really be an air war in China the way we conceive of it beyond November 37.
Right.
Because American assistance is very, very minimal by this point.
Okay.
So the Soviet assistance is absolutely overwhelming from really this like November 1937 through until it stops in the spring of 1941.
Okay.
And it was huge across so there's land, air, and financial. We're going to obviously focus on the air. Again, figures very wildly.
All
Um,
over the map, right?
so we'll go with roughly 900 aircraft were sent to China over this
Wow.
period, 543 fighters, 318 bombers. These included models that were state of the art at the time. So there's the I-15. It's a
Hmm.
biplane, but for 1937, it's pretty good. I-16, state of the art monoplane.
Yep.
SB-2, very, very good twin engine, high speed light medium bomber. TB-3, so these were bigger four engine bombers.
Okay.
DB3s as well, modern twin engines, if I recall correctly. And also lots and lots of aerial bombs. And on top of the aircraft, it's not just material support, they also send entire Soviet air units to China.
Okay. Right.
So again, the figures vary here. On the low end, I've seen roughly 700 Soviet air and ground crew participate in the war, with 200 roughly being killed.
Okay.
Um, I've seen figures as high as 2,000, just to give you a taste of the variance here.
Okay.
Um,
Order of magnitude. Right.
yeah. And as far as the highest end for aircraft I've seen, it's 1,250 is the other common higher estimate I see, as opposed to
Okay.
900. So not as, at least not as quite a big variance there.
So yeah, I
Um,
mean there were Soviet pilots in cockpits, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, right from defensive Nanjing forward.
Okay.
And they're obviously helping train Chinese pilots as well. The Chinese are flying Soviet aircraft.
Yeah.
And in this period, this is where it probably they cause the most direct trouble for the Japanese air services, because the I-15, I-16, the SB-2, et cetera, these are
Good
first-rate
planes.
aircraft.
Yeah.
So particularly the SB-2, which maybe I can discuss later,
Now
directly
go for it.
births the Key 48. But
Okay.
because the Japanese run into the SB-2 and they just can't intercept them, and they're like, we want a plane just like it.
Right.
um, um, but yeah, so it's hugely significant for this point here. Another thing that starts to shift for the Chinese is they start to develop a more realistic attitude towards what their air power should be doing. Um,
Right.
Obviously, if you lose your entire air force in a series of disasters, it makes you think.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and this is also pushed by Soviet advisors as well,
Right.
where they're like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You need to be
Right.
focusing on
Yeah.
fighters and
You can't burn
um,
Sasebo down. That's not going to happen.
yeah.
Let's do what we can do here. Right.
Yeah. So there are a series of fierce air battles fought through 38 over Wuhan, kind of the Tri-City area, very important city. Again, it's the capital at this point in the war. And as Japanese forces are, of course, rolling in to try and take it. One interesting side note that I really don't have a whole lot to specifically point to, other than I think it's very interesting. I'd love to see more on it. Is when the Chinese burst the dikes along the Yellow River, which is a
Mm.
horrible
Yeah, we talked
tragedy.
about that. Yeah.
Yep. We talked about that. Yeah.
It does cause some logistical issues for the Japanese, and they do supply some of their troops by air to try and
Oh,
keep them supplied. That it's
yeah.
literally one of those things where I'm like reading it and it's mentioned and then they move on and I'm like, no, wait,
Wait, wait.
go back to
Let's
that.
talk more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you don't see much
You see
about
mention of
Japanese air
that in the
resupply.
New Guinea campaign as well. There are fragmentary mentions in some of the Senshi Sosho volumes where they talk about the fact that the Japanese too were experimenting with what we would call biscuit bombers, trying to use G4Ms to supply some of their troops in that campaign. But there's no mention of, well, did you do that? Parachutes or what have you. I don't know, but that's kind of
Yeah, it's
fascinating.
interesting. The earliest I've seen is 1933 Reihei campaign, where I actually have more information on it. And I've even got some photos or a photo. They definitely weren't using parachutes because one of the lessons learned was you can't just hurl bags of rice out of planes because they tend to
They break.
explode.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, but and
yeah,
that's some fun anecdotes from I think one of the Japanese army officers that came where it was he described it like flower petals from heaven, is how they translated it in the intelligence
interesting.
report. Um, and I think they dropped winter clothing and stuff out of the aircraft then in 1933. Um,
Right.
but anyway, so
So,
they're rolling back into war to Wuhan. Um, And again, based on these early failures, the Chinese had started to switch to what we would call, I guess, more of a tactical oriented air force, and primarily defensive.
yeah,
So larger numbers of fighters, they start to focus again on fighter defense against the bombing raids with some limited, where they could, interdiction and close air support. Definitely are secondary to the just fighters trying to defend against Japanese attacks, but
right,
they are they do get some punches in every once in a while. Um,
right.
Now something called the Combined Pursuit Group was established in May 1937 to provide advanced fighter training to cadets for the Chinese. And this was moved in September to Lanzhou, which of course was a major hub for where a lot of the
That's
Soviet
where all the
aircraft
planes
and
are coming
everything were
in.
coming in.
Right.
And this unit would, even though it was a training unit, would often also fly in defense of Chongqing or Chengdu during later Japanese bombing campaigns. Um, Now, on the Japanese side, through 38, one of the big things is the Japanese Navy Air Service primarily is trying to wage an interdiction campaign to disrupt aid coming in from French Indochina, from Burma, etc.
Hmm.
And just try to disrupt communications and everything just more generally. So they were largely focused on roads, bridges, railways, particularly in Guangzhou. Now, this campaign doesn't really meet with a whole lot of success, generally speaking. Even at the time, foreign observers I've read are not kind to it. There's a lot of problems with accuracy. There's a lot of problems with just basically not enough aircraft for too much area. And you're
Right.
trying to hit things like a railroad. It's like, okay, well, congratulations, you hit the railroad, then the Chinese fix it. Uh,
Yeah.
um,
And on
yeah.
on on Christoph's channel too, you share some stories that in some cases the Japanese would come in for these attacks and they would drop one bomb
Mhm.
and then, oh, we missed with that one, so they circle back around and which is not conducive to the long-term health of an air crew if you're like continually circling over an objective and trying to hit a bomb at a time. But
Yeah, and one follow-up thing I have of this is the only example I've been able to find of them doing that practice in the wider war, the Pacific War, was against Repulse. Um,
oh,
One formation did it where and as a formation, so not individual aircraft, but they had two 250 kilogram bombs. They, as a formation, dropped one. That's actually the one that scores the hit on
okay,
Repulse. And then they circle back around and
and
they
drop a second.
attack a second that misses. Um, that's the only time example I've seen later on in the war where they do that. So it's like I
Yeah,
think it largely died in the in the war in
in
China.
in the war in China.
And at least in the case of the attacking repulse, I can kind of see it as like, well, you've got two bombs, so do you want to have two shots as a formation or one?
Right, or just one.
Um,
Hmm.
but
Always learning.
yeah,
So the Japanese are taking very heavy casualties in their air groups in the initial part of the war as well,
yes,
right? We haven't really talked about that.
yeah. So the anecdote that I know PD uses as well, and it's because it's in the Japanese monograph as well that the first combined air group, which was the Navy unit that was responsible primarily for central China, the Shanghai area, lost half of its air strength, or lost
Right.
half of its land-based attack aircraft specifically. So the G3Ms in the first, I think it was like couple weeks or something like that of
First
operations.
first 3 days.
First 3 days. So, okay, there you
First
go. Yeah,
three
real bad.
days. Yeah. 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 First
Um,
combined air group, 50% of its aircraft within 3 days,
In three
mostly
days.
to Chinese fighters, but also to some of their AAA.
mhm. Yeah,
That's staggering when you
yeah.
think about it.
And then the
And
nature of these attacks were generally very low level, which didn't help.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
And again, just to sort of level set, I know this is something that we've talked about before. During the war proper, Bomber Command felt that about a 4% attrition rate on average was about the most that you could sustain. Obviously, 50% in free raids, that's distinctly higher than a 4% aggregate rate. That's not what you want to see. And, my understanding is that the Japanese were just like, whoa, 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 what's going on here? And they had
Yeah.
to stand down basically fairly quickly and rethink things, did they not?
Yeah. So there's a lot of change that goes into, and that's something that I mean, I've done a whole series of videos talking about it. We can get into it here too. There's a huge amount of lessons learned
Right.
as this war goes on. And the Japanese, it's really this is the war that makes the Japanese air services mature into what we
Hmm.
kind of recognize by December 1941.
Right.
Because they didn't just spring out of a hole in the ground. And really, in 1937, a lot of their operations are bordering on, or could, I think, be fairly characterized as amateurish, or
Yes.
Mhm.
they have a long way to go in a lot of things. And Western observers do identify this as well. And then as the war progresses and the Japanese keep getting better, they do tend to notice that improvement as well.
Yeah.
Um, to the
And
point
I
that,
was just
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say I was going to put in a plug here for your 4-part series on the military aviation history channel with Christoph because you do go through that in more detail. But yeah, but I want
Mhm.
to steal that content for our channel. So pray
Oh yeah,
continue.
I can talk for hours, uh, but yeah. So as far as 38, this fighting over Wuhan, there are some initial real back and forth large air battles that are fought. I didn't bother writing gratuitous notes here, but there
Yeah.
was a lot of serious back and forth. The Japanese do get some bloody noses on a couple of occasions, but eventually they do achieve air superiority roughly by June of 1938 over Wuhan. Um, and then Wuhan itself falls late October 1938.
Hmm.
And then again, the backdrop to this is the first bombing of Chongqing, February 1938, which is kind of foreshadowing things to come.
Right.
So the fall of Wuhan is kind of a watershed moment because this is early December 1938. There's a big group sit down on the Japanese side. They're like, we've bitten off way more than we can chew with
Right.
this war. We've taken the capital they've retreated from. We've taken two capitals now, and they're
Right.
not surrendering.
Yeah.
Um, and now they've moved back into Chongqing. It's very, very deep inside interior China. Um, how do we solve this pickle that
Yeah.
we've gotten ourselves into? And one of the decisions made is that on December 2nd, there's an order issued that the air war is given highest precedence, and it authorizes attacks against, quote, strategic and political targets, end
Right.
quote. And this is in conjunction with the naval blockade, which, if I recall correctly, Richard Frank in Tower of Skulls is
Yeah.
very right to underline this. This is a very damaging and effective naval blockade.
It cuts
Um,
their economic basis out from underneath the entire KMT state because all of their revenue, or a lot of it, is predicated on import taxes that are coming in through the cities like Shanghai. If you ain't got those cities, you ain't getting no money. And all of a sudden, yeah, the beast is dying in terms of revenue base.
mhm. So basically, the gist is they're going to try and blockade and bombard China into submission.
Sure.
Um, and this is often described as kind of the first country, China becomes the first country to be subjected to the systematic bombing of civilian targets.
Right.
So prior to this point in the war, the Japanese had hit civilian targets, but it was usually like incidental. They were trying to hit something else, and they would
Yeah,
just drop them on civilian targets. This is where it's like, oh no, it's strategic and political targets, cities,
right.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah,
is becomes the
no,
target.
Target city center.
Yeah.
yeah. This is Arthur Harris, and they're doing it in 38. So yeah,
Now, so as we kind of roll into 39 here, um, at this point, again, numbers are whatever, but the Chinese Air Force is reduced to about 100 aircraft at the beginning of 1939. Um, and then Japanese bombing of interior cities and air bases start to really pick up. So generally speaking, the Japanese Army Air Service was focused on Lanzhou, again, that important city that are
yeah,
seeing a lot of Soviet assistance coming in. Um, and the Japanese Navy Air Service generally tended to focus on Chongqing
okay,
itself. Um, so January 15th, 1939, that's the first raid on Chongqing that hit predominantly civilian quarters of the city.
right.
So early, the handful of earlier raids were usually targeting the air bases and things around the city that you could at least mildly justify as military
As
targets.
military targets, and now the gloves are off, and we're going for the civilians. And this
Yeah.
is primarily an incendiary raid, is it not?
So
Or a
the
mixture?
big the yeah, there's sometimes a mixture. Like Japanese bomb loads, obviously they tend to vary a lot. With the G3M, you can configure it in ways where you don't even need to carry the same size of bomb either. So
Mm,
you can see mixed bomb loads like 1 250 and a handful of 60s or whatever, various types.
yeah,
Um, the big incendiary HE attack against Chongqing is the 3rd, 4th of May, 1939. That had roughly 3,700 deaths, again, roughly 2,650 injuries, and then about just under 5,000 structures destroyed. So that was a really big, that's like the one of the big, that's the
that's
incendiary raid on
yeah.
Chongqing.
And again, by 1942 standards, that's damned effective. That's a very successful attack
Hmm.
by the standards of the day. And yeah, they're doing it 4 years before Bomber Command was capable of doing it themselves.
Hmm.
Interesting.
And then on the side, interdiction efforts are continuing in southern China with the same limited success. I think that's worth noting.
Okay.
Again, lots of criticism can be leveled toward it. I've seen quite a bit from both historians and contemporaries. I think like in context for the late 1930s and the limited number of aircraft and everything, it's kind of like, yeah, you're trying to cover all of southern China in an interdiction campaign. It's really,
Come on. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a
you're.
huge country,
Mhm.
right?
Um, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about 39. It's just kind of more things are starting to pick up. There are some of the first, I think in mid 1939 is Operation 100, which is a
Yeah.
joint Army Navy operation. Um, this one, there's very little written about it. It gets confusing because even in the Japanese monograph, the Japanese Army, um, whoever they were interviewing or having write it, uh, didn't seem to it kept mixing up the operation names. So
Oh,
he usually on the art so on the army side on the monograph he's just going first operation, second operation, third operation, and then um, more famously the Navy usually had Operation 100, 101, 102.
right.
Um, the biggest one is Operation 101, which I think we can kind of roll into. So there is an
Yeah.
earlier operation, it's just smaller, doing kind of the same kind of job. Um, the big thing with
And this
the
starts in April 1940, right?
Operation 101, yeah, yeah, late
Okay.
April, early May 1940, and it runs through August
Okay.
of 1940 for Operation 101. On the Chinese side of things, supplies of new Soviet aircraft and other equipment start to slow um, in mid 1940.
Hmm.
Um, before and like the flow of Soviet aviators pretty much stops completely by mid 1940.
What's driving that?
Increasing they basically want to pull people back home and resources back home.
Okay.
Also, after the conclusion of the Nomonhan incident, the
Yeah.
Soviets start to slowly lose interest in containing Japan. So a lot of their motivation for providing such extensive assistance to China earlier than this is
Yeah.
to they see it as a quagmire and they want to encourage that quagmire so that the Japanese army has better things to do than bother them.
Right.
Um,
Right. Fair.
where after they get slapped around in 1939 in Wuhan, this
Yeah.
that impetus, like the Soviets start feeling a little bit more comfortable just kind
Right.
of leaving the Far East as it is.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. We taught the Japanese a lesson, and so now we don't have to invest so much in containing them.
yeah.
Okay.
So it does start to constrict. Again, with the qualification about figures, there are maybe about 160 aircraft available to defend Chongqing in the area,
Hmm.
surrounding area in 1940. And the reason why I
Which is
emphasize,
which is
yes,
more
yeah.
than the Japanese are using in this attack, or at least from the Japanese Navy side. They've got, I think, 120 aircraft. I think that's what I
Yeah,
read.
yeah,
And
roughly.
and this is under the command of Rear Admiral Onishi Takejiro, who's a cat that
Hmm.
we're going to see again because Onishi is the father of the kamikaze, and here he is in China, basically in charge of their largest strategic bombing operation to date.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
and this is so for Operation 101, this is the big one. This is the
mhm.
height of the most intense bombing that will take place in the China theater all the way to 45.
Okay.
And it runs from May to August 1940. I think it starts at late April, but basically spring, summer. And the reason why they're always spring, summer is that Chongqing tends to be covered in fog pretty much every other
Oh,
part of the year.
right.
So they need to be able to see the city that they're trying to hit.
Got it.
This is technically a combined Army-Navy operation. Again, the Army is predominantly focused further north against Lanzhou. The main focus of Operation 101 is against Chengdu and particularly Chongqing. Again, Chongqing, the wartime capital.
Hmm.
Um, Again, there's a lot of variance with sorties and things between sources. So I've got a few isolated statistics that don't necessarily directly align. Like, got
Right.
one that says Chongqing was hit over 50 times in 110 days, with the peak being in June. And that was just the absolute height of the bombing against
Hmm.
Chongqing. I've got another figure where in 1940 overall there were 3,715 sorties, which is individual aircraft, of course, in 100 across 182 raids. All but 14 of them
Yeah.
were in daylight on
Right.
Chongqing.
If you grind those numbers, it's like 20 planes a raid is kind of what it comes down to. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's going to be some raids that are very large and then some that are very
Hmm.
small. They experiment with all sorts of different things like keeping Chongqing under near constant bombardment for as long as
Hmm.
they can to just again because it is a terror campaign. They are trying
Right.
to wear down their willingness to resist. So they even do play around with that where I want to say there was a single time where the Chongqing was under constant air attack for about 96 hours.
Wow.
And it was just like, just small flights of bombers coming in and dropping bombs in a
All the
train.
time. Yeah.
Um, and throughout this giant campaign, there were about 9 G3Ms shot down,
Okay.
and about 100 aircraft damaged, primarily G3Ms. Again, the reason for these really low loss of G3Ms, like actually shot down outright, was they were generally attacking at high altitudes, so they could be seen at upwards of 23,000 feet.
Yeah.
Which kind of big deal for the Japanese gaining experience in that they're using oxygen and things like that.
Right.
Um, and it
And
just made
and
it. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask about the Army now. Has have they received the Type 97 twin engine bomber at this point? And are they that's a Sally, isn't it? Or
Yeah, yeah, that's the code. Yeah,
the
yeah,
Sally?
yeah.
Are
So
they
they,
using it in conjunction then with Navy Nels? Are they doing joint operations or are they separate raids? How's that
so they're
all
they're
working?
generally separate raids. And I
Okay.
might be mistaken here if there was a joint one. I can't think of one that was actually Army and Navy together.
Yeah.
I want to say it probably happened, but I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head. They were usually like they were part of this joint operation, but they were targeting different
Things.
things.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they do have the Key 21, which is a decent performance bomber
Yeah.
for the time. It's got enough legs to at least reach relatively deep in. A key thing with the 1940 campaign is there's no fighter escort because they can't reach. So the Navy is
Yeah.
predominantly still rocking the A5M. Um, I know the Zero is starting to inch its way into
We're going
very
to talk
small
about that.
numbers.
Yep.
And then, of course, it makes its big uh, victory debut in September 1940, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But during this campaign, the Japanese themselves, the Navy does identify that they had exceeded their threshold for acceptable losses.
Losses.
I think they had it pegged at about 10% between damaged and lost, and they're like, we don't like that.
Mm,
And one of their big emphasis was we really need to get fighter escort deep into China
right.
to keep them off. Again, the Chinese, the reason why the initial losses were so low, like for outright shot down, is again the AA on the ground is predominantly there to either damage stuff or disrupt formations, make them fly high to throw off accuracy. Chinese
70
fighters,
75 millimeter isn't going to reach up to
Mm-mm.
23,000 feet very effectively. And your engagement window is relatively limited as well.
yeah.
So,
And then it was a struggle for the Chinese fighters as well. They were just not designed to be up at that altitude.
hmm,
At most, the Chinese did a very good early warning, again, consistently.
sure.
In fact, sometimes their early warning was so good that pretty much from nearly the moment that the Japanese raids would lift off, they would know
They
they were
knew.
coming.
Right.
They had just a network of telephones and radios and ground observers and all that. Um, Even with that, the Chinese fighters, if they can manage to climb up there, you get maybe one pass because your engine is struggling so much
Right.
to output acceptable power at that altitude. You get maybe one firing pass and you're done.
And that's it. Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, this pretty much slams shut with what probably a lot of people have been waiting for us to get to is the Zero shows
The
up.
zero. Yeah.
Um, and on September 13th, 1940, that is when famously the Zero scores its first air-to-air kills.
Yep.
Actually, that's something I want to flesh out just a little bit because
Go.
it's such a part of the legend of the Zero. Um, is that the context for this is again, it was no surprise here. It was a raid against Chongqing. 27 G3Ms had come in and bombed Chongqing, and they were outbound. And the Chinese decided to try and intercept. They had a flight of about 25 I-15s and 9 I-16s that were climbing to intercept this departing force of G3Ms.
Hmm.
What they didn't know is that there were 13 Zeros of the 12th Kokutai, and these Zeros were able to bounce the Chinese formation out of the sun. They scattered the I-16 top cover, and then they ripped down into the I-15s that were still stuck at low energy in their climbs.
Yeah.
The fight actually went on about 30 minutes, and in the end, 13 Chinese aircraft shot down, 11 damaged. 3 to 4 Zeros had been damaged. You get different
Nobody
numbers.
shot down.
None shot down. 27 aircraft were claimed shot down by the Japanese, which is a common figure you'll see in a lot of books out there. But the real total from what we can determine is 13 Chinese aircraft shot down,
Mm.
11 damaged. Very convincing one-sided
Yeah, for
victory for
sure.
the Zero. What I want to underline is it doesn't mean that the Zero was a super fighter. It's just the big thing is the Zero had the operational range to get there. That
Yeah,
was really key. And also, yes, it was a newer generation fighter, but really the main thing in this particular engagement is, I mean, the Chinese were caught in an absolutely ruinous tactical position.
sure.
Um, they were surprised. They were at an energy disadvantage. Like,
Out of the
it,
sun.
yeah, if the Japanese had A5Ms there in some alternate reality, the result probably would have been similar.
Roughly the
It was,
same. Right.
yeah, it's um, but it kind of that's weaved in that 27 aircraft destroyed gets weaved into the Zero mythos.
Right.
Uh, and from this point on, the Chinese, I think quite rightfully, they are very, very reluctant to try and intercept Japanese formations that are escorted by fighters, Zeros primarily.
Yep.
And they started fighting what I kind of call, I guess Richard Frank calls it a guerrilla war in the air. I've called it
Mm-mm.
asymmetric war in the air, same thing, where the Chinese they'll attack targets of opportunity or if they have like overwhelming advantage in a particular area, but they spend a lot of time dispersed and refusing to engage against formations of Zeros that are prowling around on fighter sweeps and that kind of thing. And that
Mm.
you can almost feel the frustration on the Japanese side of like,
Mm-mm.
Right.
why won't they come out and we can finish them off?
Yeah.
And it's because the Chinese don't want that.
Yeah.
And
you got to think that by this time, the Chinese fighter pilots who have made it this far in the war are a fairly cynical, hardened lot. Have seen what has happened to a lot of their compatriots over the intervening 2.5 years or whatever.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and
It's amazing when you think about it. I mean, we're talking about this in, 1939, 1940, about Chinese pilots refusing to engage. Well, the same thing happens in 1945 in Japan and in
mhm,
Germany. They're husbanding their forces
yeah,
because,
you've only
and
got so much left.
well, not just that, but I mean, it's the F-6F and the F-4U are ruling the skies over Japan, and then Germany is the 51s. They're ruling the skies over Germany, and they don't want to, throw
Yeah,
meat into the grinder in
right.
these latter stages. They want to keep these people back as much as they can. So it's amazing how things are the same,
Right.
through different stages of the war.
yeah.
Yeah.
And this kind of 1940, 41 period, it's kind of the darkest years of the air war in China.
Right.
It
For the
is
Chinese.
the point that the Japanese effectively have air supremacy, particularly from September 1940. Not just air superiority, air supremacy, and
Right.
they can kind of do whatever they want, wherever they want, and the Chinese just try to make do.
Yeah.
Because again, Soviet assistance stops entirely, predictably, in the spring of 1941. Gee, I wonder why.
Hmm.
And again, like Western Allied assistance hasn't quite picked up yet. So
Yeah.
there's this gap, um, and they just kind
Although
of run out of steam.
I was just going to mention though too that one of the things that Petey talks about though is that as tensions with the U.S. are increasing, the number of Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft in China begins to wind down as well because
Yeah,
the Navy wants to be pulling those medium bomber Kokutai out to do training with them because their whole shtick is that they're supposed to be operating with the Navy and doing long range naval attack. And we can't very well train for that if we're bombing Chongqing.
yeah,
So, yeah, I think by the end of 1940, the Navy is going to be down to just two composite air groups, and most of those apparently are short-ranged carrier aircraft, but being flown by the likes of Tominaga and those sorts of guys. Does that ring true with what you've
yeah,
seen too?
yeah. So the Navy starts drawing down to work up for other purposes. I guess you could say their real job,
Right?
um, as envisioned. And really, the only other big thing that happens in kind of that December 41 period in China is Operation 102, which was supposed to be the bigger uh, up to sequel to Operation 101, but actually it's canceled only a month into operations in August 1931. Um,
41.
or sorry, 41, yes.
Yeah,
Um, because they finally pull out the last of the long range Navy units in
because
theater.
we're
In
getting
fact,
ready
almost
for a war
entirely.
at this point.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mhm.
the oil embargo has been put
A
into
big
place,
war.
and yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
I guess the main thing to underline with 102, I guess it's the combat debut of the G4M.
Mhm.
They test them out,
Ready.
and uh, Zeros are able to again consistently escort. There is one very particular example Osamu Tagia points out in his book where a fighter sweep is conducted at ridiculous range with a Chutai of Zeros flown at night. They could attack in the early morning, and they used a G4M as a navigation aid.
Oh, okay.
Um, and they kind of pull it off as part of this operation. It's very impressive. But again, it's cut short. And now that we've kind of reached the end of the main bombing of Chongqing, um, I get another figure I can give you is over the kind of the 4 years of direct bombing of Chongqing. So from February 1938 to August 1943, which is the final raid.
Yeah,
And there's only one raid on Chongqing in 1943 and none in 1942. Um, there were about 9,500 individual sorties flown against Chongqing
that's a
Yeah.
lot.
over that period.
And the
Against
city is leveled.
Oh
It's
yeah,
just
yeah. It's like some
completely
other
leveled.
figures. It's like 10,000 homes destroyed, 15,000 killed, 20,000 injured, and Chongqing is rubble.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah. And
There's a quote by an IJN aviator that I wrote down that I thought was amazing. He said, flying over Chongqing, he said that the city looked like the excavated remains of a very ancient civilization. And
Yeah,
that's in 1940 that that this quote comes from. And
right.
that is some serious devastation. That's wiping the
yeah.
city off the face of the map.
But it also points to just sort of the futility of this campaign as a whole, and that by
Most of them.
yeah, by 41, you really are engaged in just making the rubble bounce, but
Yep.
you have not solved your overriding political problem, which is to make the KMT come to the negotiating table.
Yep.
So, you know, what lessons did the Japanese learn, I guess, in terms of strategic bombing, which also feeds into a, sort of a corollary. Why weren't Western air forces paying more attention to this too? Um, you certainly don't have any lack of confidence on the part of the British that they're going to be able to bring Germany to its knees
Hmm.
through just more.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's it kind of joins that long string of failed terror bombing campaigns,
right.
where they just don't bring about any satisfactory conclusion. Chongqing as a city was like an inner China backwater before 1938 when it became the capital. There weren't even like sizable factories or anything that you could target.
Yeah,
It became the wartime capital through expedience.
right.
So it's like, and they had the nature of it. It was they had a lot of really good rock. They could dig very deep underground hardened shelters into. Um, so it's like that's why, for example, even though you get those really big civilian losses in a lot of the initial, like that 34 May 1939 raid, but
Yeah,
then in the end, like, you get the figures of 15,000 killed total.
yes,
It's like over this time, they get better and better at civil defense.
yeah.
And
And I've read some articles on that. Yeah, they take it really seriously, as you can imagine. Get to your shelters, but by 42, you've got a lot of shelters at this point in that city.
yeah, it's a very, very hard target. And I think Edna Tow notes, like, even during the height of the bombing in 1940, it's like you could still come in and out of Chongqing. Like, they were still getting aid in,
Yeah,
reporters were going in and out. It failed ultimately. It's political
right,
objective.
right.
Um, yeah. Um,
So I was just going to say that one of the things you've read more of the intel reports coming out of China than probably any human being on the planet. It seems. I mean,
so
this is what you wrote your master's on, is it not?
yeah, yeah. So that's where I can draw in a lot of the unique observations of people at the time, and it is interesting. Because you can see not only the development of Japanese aviation through the eyes of these observers, which are generally pretty accurate, I would say, um, and then just yeah, their impressions of the air war overall.
Right.
And I think like what hampers some of the wider distillation of this reporting that comes out of China. The most observed part of the war is early on, 37 over Shanghai,
Hmm.
for obvious reasons. There's lots of
Yeah.
foreigners there. It's easy to,
Foreign legation
yeah,
there and all that stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And in that, as we've established, the Japanese don't exactly put on their best showing over Shanghai in 1937, which can color some perceptions. And then for later on, as the Chinese improve or as the Japanese improve, um, the it's less observed generally. But then when it is observed, that observation is usually very good, but it can usually be uh, belittled by, when it gets back stateside or even back in Tokyo, because
Yeah.
it's literal quote, Orientals fighting Orientals.
Mhm.
So, and even like I would say, some of the smarter observers, there was a lecture given by the naval attaché, and I can't remember the year. I'd have to look. But where he's talking about the war in China, and he's like underlining the improvements in the capabilities of Japanese air power. But he almost has to have this whole lengthy preface to he's talking to U.S. Navy officers.
Yeah.
And he has this whole preface of like, listen, I know they're fighting the Chinese, and I know the Chinese suck, but but listen to me.
Clever, comma. Yeah, right. But
Yeah.
still,
So that you kind of get this reinforcing thing where it's just like we think the Chinese are bad, and there's a lot of things to criticize the Chinese Air Force about, but also they're not as I would argue they're not quite as bad as they're characterized in some of this reporting.
yeah,
And it becomes kind of a feedback loop of like the Chinese are bad, but the Japanese aren't winning. But the Chinese are bad, but the Japanese aren't winning.
yeah,
And
yeah.
um, that starts causing significant problems. Some of these interesting observations, though, like that are directly coming out of China, and it's not just Chenault. I know he likes to take all the
Every
credit that he was the
well,
only one,
I
but
saw that eye roll, Seth. What was it?
um,
Uh,
Not
we'll
not
talk
a
about
big.
Chenault later.
Okay, we
he
can we can.
there's good reporting. He does know his stuff. He's just
You sure?
in his post-war memoir, he tends to be like, I was totally ignored. I was the only one that was sending,
Don't
and
they
it's like,
all? I mean,
yeah, yeah. And it's like, well, you
blood
weren't
and
being
coral,
totally
man.
ignored. I can see his information getting back. And there's the various attachés stationed in China. There's
Mhm.
people with I always forget, 4th Marine Regiment, right? I'm not insane.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
They're observing as well. And the naval attachés back in Tokyo and military attachés, they're putting out a lot of pretty good work as well. I mean, also like random observers they interview and stuff. There's lots of people just wandering around in China. There's American industrialists and
Sure.
private pilots, and in fact to this day, and um, I, I think the best like description of a Hineri Komi like air combat
Yeah.
maneuver um, is was written by an American pilot who observed it directly overhead in southern China. He was
Oh,
watching it
interesting.
happen and he was describing it, and I think it's such a great description. Um, and one thing that's he as part of it,
Nice.
like it's kind of undermined by the he kind of I haven't worked it out yet, but he kind of had some panic about some fictional plane like that didn't exist. It's like a retractable
Okay.
landing gear, and he was gushing about it. And it got back to his description got back to the Japanese or the Navy attaché in Tokyo, and he's like, "Okay, this is ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
this plane doesn't exist." But they kind of missed the whole description of the air combat maneuver.
I'm
Um,
trying to find my picture of. We'll put a picture of the Hinari Colby maneuver. It was,
yeah.
anybody who's into fighters and that kind of thing, you know about Immelmans and split S's and all that good stuff. Well, the Hinari Komi is this homegrown Japanese. Uh, what's the analog in the Soviet, the Ukachev's Cobra or whatever that is. I
Oh
can't,
yeah.
yeah, or whatever that damn thing is. Anyway, yeah, the Japanese had this homegrown maneuver that would allow you to cut in on the turning circle of an opposing fighter, and it was actually quite effective if
Mhm.
used by a trained professional. In fact, there are some quotes in the source material that Japanese aviators are like, yeah, the reason we won this battle, sort of in the middle portion of the war, was because we had good pilots. They all knew the Hinari Komi, and they could cut in on even a plane like an I-15 or an I-16.
Mhm.
So anyway,
Yeah, it's a neat little air combat maneuver. But yeah, there's lots of like great stuff that comes out of the reporting like that. I would say it's generally the reporting is very good. And it's so good that as a historian you can actually use it to track improvement in the Japanese air services.
interesting.
There's one from I think 40. I'm pulling entirely from memory here, where they're observing the Operation 101 effectively against Chongqing, and they're like, listen, like this is nothing. This is completely unrelated to what we saw in 37. It's
Right.
like these are different air organizations now.
Yeah.
They're like there's constant reconnaissance flights. They're checking weather. They're sending fighter sweeps. The raids come
Yeah.
in, and then this is all a different ball game now.
Right.
Um, and they're
That the
talking to the
Japanese
Chinese
have
too.
learned. Yeah.
Yeah,
They've
yeah.
learned some lessons. Right.
So like another one from 41 where they're outlining like their horizontal bombing is good and it's constantly improving. Their formation discipline is excellent. Their Uh, the fight coordination of fighter escort is excellent. The use of fighter sweeps is dangerous. Like they're a fully functioning long range offensive system now, is
Right.
effectively the gist of it. Um,
Okay, so then
yeah.
translate that in. It does not seem though as if a lot of those warnings have been internalized by cats like Brereton in the Philippines, for instance, or maybe I'm wrong. I mean, prove me wrong, I guess I would say.
Yeah, and this is still something I'm like I constantly am still trying to work out like where things are being missed. And I think like there's one little tidbit in I think the introduction of Bloody Shambles where they were talking about when they were interviewing pursuit pilots in the Philippines and
Yeah,
how they were like asking them, it's like, what were you using to inform your like what the Japanese get the measure of the Japanese before the war? And they didn't really bring up like, field manuals or intelligence bulletins or anything like that. They went straight to like a an article in Air News um, by Lucius Zakharov or something like that. I have it, but where it's obviously more dismissive
not a
of Japanese capability than what you'd
yeah,
get usually if you were looking just entirely at primary sources. There's a lot of interaction too between the two. That's like a whole other 6 hour discussion.
right. I, do we
Yeah.
see a pattern here of um, okay, I see this hard data in front of my face, but my cultural stereotypes are this, and
Yeah.
therefore I fall back on that.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of some of the conclusions. So even if you got like really good raw observations, some of the analysis pulled from it is more pulling from what we would call, or what they called at the time, national characteristics, which are, it put simply, a set of national-based stereotypes.
Right.
Um, so the reason why I like racism is a part of it, but it's bigger than that. Um,
Mhm.
and like these national characteristics are used more broadly. It's not even just toward Japan. It's like Americans looking at the Germans use national characteristics of the Germans to inform some of their
Mhm.
understanding, that kind of thing. Um, and with the Japanese, like the big ones that come to the fore are that the Japanese can't innovate. The
Mhm.
Japanese are predisposed to being just bad with technology.
Mhm.
Um, the Japanese are rigid, uh, unimaginative. Those kinds of things are people are stewing in them, and these ideas are so old that as I explained, like when we're reading, such and such naval attaché in 1930, whatever, these ideas, these stereotypes of the Japanese had been laid down before he was born. Like, so
Sure.
by the time he gets there, it's like just immutable fact to him
Right.
that this is how the Japanese are, and that definitely colors sometimes the creation of the analysis, but also when people are reading into it, they're less likely to believe that, for example, the big thing that goes off the rails is when the Japanese aviation industry starts actually developing serious independence in design.
Yes.
They really struggle to internalize that because the Japanese copy. That's what the Japanese do.
Right.
And yeah.
Well, and you see persistent, reports during the early part of the war too. Oh, those were Messerschmitts, and there must have been German
Right.
pilots in there, and that kind of nonsense as well. So
Mhm.
that takes. I. How much do you know about? I, you've got good information about what the Americans are writing about, and then how they're internalizing that. What do we know about the British? Because I
A
got to be
decent amount. Yeah, and
okay.
they're often linked. They become more and more linked the closer you get to 41. Um, so it's broadly similar.
Yeah.
They are usually pulling a lot in the same types of stereotypes. There's some really good work out there on that. I think some of the best, and it's not just because he was my supervisor, but John Ferris.
Right. Right.
He did a lot of really fun, really fantastic work on this. I think one of my favorite articles to this day on the subject is still, it's specifically on the Japanese Army ground forces, but Worthy of Some Better Enemy journal article,
Mm,
where he has just such a wonderful way of like laying out how this stuff works.
yeah.
And with the British, they are definitely in that same sphere. Like, for example, a lot of the motivation behind the unofficial aviation mission that was helping out the Japanese Navy Air Service back in the early 1920s
Yeah, the
um,
simple mission.
was that there was an assumption that if we get our foot in the door, the Japanese will be a reliable export customer for our aircraft forever,
Hmm.
and that like we can keep the Japanese on a leash
Right.
because they're not going to learn themselves. They're not going to create their own aircraft. It's like they'll just do what we give them.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, that kind of ends up going off the rails. But
Right.
there is a lot of that
Yeah.
still on the British side as
I've
well.
always really admired the Japanese approach to technology adoption throughout that time period, in that they looked around and they're like, okay, who's got the best army? The Germans, clearly. Who's got the best navy? The Royal Navy. We're gonna go learn from them. We're going to first we will purchase their technology, then we will
Mhm.
license build their technology, and
And then
then
we'll
yeah, by the
improve
time
on
you
it.
get to now it's ours.
Yeah.
We can do this stuff on our own. Thank you very much. And obviously the air services lag that model in terms of where they were with surface ships and that sort of thing. But the same thing has happened
Mhm.
by the early 1930s. That these are independent entities. The Japanese can design their own planes, and they're just as good as the ones in the West. Thank you very
Yep.
much.
Yep. And one
So,
book I can plug actually that's exactly about that is Wing Wings for
oh,
the
look at that.
Rising Sun by Jürgen Meltzer,
Okay.
which is literally just a whole book about what foreign uh, nations contributed to the Japanese aviation industry and
Hmm.
how it all worked in and everything. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Um, and
But
yeah,
then, yeah,
it's
you get these attitudes on the brink of war,
yeah,
though. I'm spacing the guy's name, the theater commander in Malay, Brooke Popham, is that?
yeah,
Uh,
pop them, yeah, yeah,
Popham, who, oh yeah, the Brewster Buffalo is going to be perfectly sufficient, for taking. We'll see how, and we'll talk about that when we get into the Malaya campaign here in the not too distant future. Um, One of the things that you impressed upon me regarding that campaign is that a lot of people think that Malaya was fought against the Zero, but it wasn't. There was not a Zero to be had in that campaign. You're all going up against Japanese Army aircraft, and the majority of them were actually older generation Ki 27 Nates that had entered service a year before the Brewster Buffalo, and they're still cleaning the British clocks, even using that older airframe.
yeah. That's something I like to emphasize is I think like a lot of analysis of early Japanese success in particular tends to devolve very quickly to technology.
Yes,
Where it's just like the Zero is a wonder plane, it's everywhere, and it's the main cause of everything.
right.
And part of that is like, I mean, you can even see it starting right from when all the disasters are happening. Like the Zero, it very quickly becomes, I've called it kind of the tiger of the East. Like
Mhm.
everything's a Zero, and the Zero is
Everything's an 88.
destroying
Right,
everything. Um,
right.
and the the reality is, of course, that the Japanese Army Air Service exists and they've got their own aircraft. A lot of them are older Ki 27s. With the Malaya Singapore campaign, the Zero makes very brief appearances. And then in
Hmm.
Burma, it doesn't show up at all. But the reason why the Zero becomes so strongly associated with Burma is particularly the AVG, the Flying Tigers,
Yes,
consistently say that they were fighting Zeros when actually they were fighting Ki 43s or a handful of
Oscars.
experimental Ki 44s, Tojo.
Uh,
Um, just
yeah,
mistakes in aircraft identification that happen constantly, and the British do it a lot in Malaya too when they're fighting Ki 43s, mainly because I don't want to criticize them too much because the Ki 43 was pretty new, and
yeah.
actually it hadn't really worked into like identification manuals and stuff yet that the Japanese Army had a retractable landing gear single seat fighter.
Single engine monocoque
So
fighter. Yeah.
yeah, so they
And
yeah.
honestly, it kind of looks like a Zero too. I mean,
Hmm.
Yeah, at a glance, like
yeah, at a glance, exactly. If you're fighting
yeah,
this thing and it zips by you at 300 miles an hour or whatever,
Exactly.
I don't know, look like a Zero to me, Tony. So
exactly.
anyway,
So, yeah, and I guess the emphasis is like, I think a lot of the initial success from the Japanese side is they had developed an effective air power. Now they have weaknesses,
yeah,
but but they are good at what they do. So there's one thing that I always find kind of amusing that's kind of casually taken for granted by a lot of histories that I've read is like that the Japanese just sustain a significant air campaign just from like Taiwan to like halfway down, Luzon. And it's just
Yeah,
like, oh yeah, they just did that. It's like, well,
that's really
they had to
impressive
figure out how to do
how to
that.
do that. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and you can start to see some of the cracks too in like as I've discussed elsewhere, where I think the Japanese Navy almost starts getting addicted to the ability to do ridiculous long range operations to the point that
Yeah, and I'm going to stop you there because we would love to have you back at some point to talk a little more about the air war from Rabaul down the
Mhm.
Solomons, because
Yes.
that, I think is a case in point of really trying to project power a little bit too far away, that your fighter can only barely reach down there, even with your Wunder fighter, the Zero. So, that can be but that does bring up another question I guess I would have is, if okay, we've talked about the fact that the allies are having difficulties internalizing what they're seeing with their own eyes with their attaches in China, and then digesting that and putting that into actionable training materials and whatnot for your people in the Philippines and whatnot. What lessons are the Japanese taking out of China for good or ill that then
Mhm.
inform the early parts of their war against us and the British?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, I break it down into a handful of categories, and there's one thing that's conspicuous by its absence, and it's not because I don't think anything happened, it's because I don't know based on the sources I've read, and that's things to do with close air support.
Yeah,
Um, there's just like the only thing because as often like since we have so few Japanese records that have made their way into English and work looking at something like close air support of the Japanese Air Service, Army Air Service specifically,
yeah,
it
because
means that
the
usually,
army is just like a black hole as
yeah,
far as Western scholarship is concerned. It seems
yeah.
like.
Yeah, like the most we have are usually ospreys that are generally pretty good, but they're
Yeah,
like focused on this osprey is about the Key 43 and its
right.
aces. So you're left to like read between the lines on trying to figure out what the Army Air Service is like as an institution, like
Yeah,
what it's doing. Um, and one big gap there is this like, well, how are they cooperating with the army? Because you always get it from the Japanese side. It's like they bombed this. And then the Allied perspective is, oh my God, we got bombed. But, but
yeah,
there's not a lot of explanation as to what's going
Mhm.
on.
yeah.
Um, but so it's these lessons learned are primarily going to be Navy to be, although I can bring in the Army a little bit here. But it's usually like for fighter formations and discipline is a huge one that improves spectacularly and changes a lot through the war in China. And fighter
Yeah.
tactics go hand in hand with that, as well as fighter escort for bombers is probably the most famous that they pull out of China. Fighter sweeps, which go in conjunction with that, the ability to conduct long range operations, and then some of the problems being airfield construction defense.
Hmm.
And then also the mixed bag that is the impact on Japanese aviation technology, also that they draw from lessons in China. Um, Now, if you want me to
Well,
go
they
for another 2 hours, I can, but we'll,
actually, okay, now I'm going way back to the beginning of the China Air War. There's this fragmentary quote here in some of the Chongqing raids that the Japanese aircrew didn't use parachutes.
mm.
Is this
Mhm.
true?
Yeah. So the
Or-
easy answer for parachutes related to the Japanese Army Air Service is they did,
Okay.
all of them. The Navy is hit and miss. So some fighter units do, some don't.
Hmm.
The RICO operating the land-based attack aircraft, the bombers, um, generally speaking, over enemy territory, I can't think of an example where they do. Like it's just not in the culture or and the
Yeah, you just
only
don't want to be taken prisoner, and if I'm going down, I'm going down with my whole crew. I don't want to.
Exactly.
yeah, and the
Holy
only thing
Moses.
I can reach at is that there was definitely a preference to try and stay in the aircraft and ditch it so that you could stay together with all of your
Yeah,
equipment and everything like that. But it's like, okay, but you could still do that and have a parachute.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you're already, reduced to being a flaming pencil, dropping vertically, I mean, you're not ditching this thing. It's time.
yeah,
Then
Get out.
again, the the pushback to the pushback is given the rate of POW exchanges, the number of Japanese and Chinese POWs who came through this war can be counted on one hand. Even if you do make it down to the ground alive, the Chinese are going to kill you.
yeah, yeah. Like I guess the real and I that it can open up a whole other discussion of like how much does, for example, a Japanese aircrew not carrying a parachute actually matter if, from the cynical, cold, inhumane perspective of the Japanese military leadership, the
Yeah,
difference between a Japanese Zero pilot who gets shot down over Darwin
yeah,
and dies versus one who gets shot down over Darwin and survives is that the one that survives might talk. That's
right.
not to say that there was a top-down policy. There wasn't. In fact, I want to say this is really fuzzy, but I want to say there was encouragement. They were trying to get more of the fighter
Yeah,
pilots to wear parachutes more, but like there was some units just didn't want to.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, um,
Fascinating.
yeah, it's interesting. And the army again, the army just yeah, they wore parachutes,
Okay.
which is in fact there's lots of interesting things that we don't see as much when you're looking at certain accounts, but as the air war in the South Pacific starts to turn into defensive for the Japanese and kind of the army increasingly is left holding the bag.
Hmm.
Um, as the
Particularly in New Guinea.
yeah,
Right.
they're fighting defensively over their airfields and a lot of the advantages that we talk about for the Americans early on in the war, or the Allies
Sure.
generally, where they're getting shot down over their own airfields and they're
Yeah.
able to do dead stick landings or whatever. You actually do start seeing that a lot for army pilots. There's one army
Mhm.
pilot who was shot down multiple times, and he'd get shot down his K-43, he'd hop out, he'd go back to get another one. Um,
Yeah.
because they have that advantage when they're fighting defensively.
Sure.
Um, and I guess
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
as
preserve
people,
that aviator's life. It's a different
yeah,
different ball game than fighting over
which
the slot.
which goes hand in hand with the Army generally taking aircraft protection more seriously than the Navy. So they do start adding armor and fuel tank protection quite early on in pretty much all their aircraft. Like the Ki-43-1, even as light as it is, didn't initially have an armor plate, but it did have rudimentary fuel tank protection even from early production. But they were basically the issue was since it was delaminating in the tropical heat, and they
Mm,
were finding in Burma was one of the problems. It was also pretty thin, so it's like only somewhat effective against rifle caliber, but anything larger than that, it's useless.
right.
Which it was not uncommon for protected fuel tanks at that time, but it improves through the war. They get armor eventually in the Ki-43 as well, for example. Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to demolish that myth. I mean, that is what we live for here on the channel
Yeah.
is just
Yeah.
poking holes and things. So
Oh yeah, and I'm sure if I could structure it out, I could do a better job. But yeah, it's
no,
interesting, and for people that are really interested, it's out of reach. It's too I've reached a couple books, but that one's
right.
a
This one's
shelf too
out. Yeah,
far.
yeah.
But there's
Too
Richard
far.
Dunn and the very creatively named Exploding Fuel Tanks.
Okay.
If you want to read on fuel
What it's
Eye-watering
about.
tanks.
levels of detail.
On that stuff. And it's just kind of interesting from because he can look at the stuff like this is what the Japanese factory said they were installing in T-43 twos versus this is what we were finding in crashed wrecks in the South Pacific. And it's kind
Right.
of interesting seeing the difference and because sometimes, maybe there was fuel tank damage sustained by an aircraft that wasn't had originally installed a self-sealing fuel tank, but on the front line, well, you need a new fuel tank, but all we've got are unprotected ones. So they'd sometimes
Right.
find later models with an unprotected fuel tank, like in one wing, like,
Yeah.
like that kind of thing.
Right. I
So,
stripped this tank out of the boneyard and put
yeah.
it on your bird just because you had to have a fuel tank. And
Use
yeah,
what you got, man.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes
Use
sense.
what's available.
Okay, yeah. So I can run through quick post December 7, 1941. So as you kind
Yeah.
of mentioned, the air war starts tailing off. Like again, the high water mark is mid 1940. And then once the wider war sets off, the Japanese Navy Air Service is almost entirely out of the picture in China. They have,
We out. Yeah.
yeah, like
Right.
they have a handful of a couple of fighter units based out of Hainan for a bit, and that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
Got other
um,
things to do.
yeah, exactly. And so Allied air power in China had kind of little strategic offensive capability in China prior to 1943. With American assistance, the Chinese Air Force became kind of a modest but effective tactical air force that was kind of able to exert pressure on the Japanese army, kind of alongside the U.S. Army Air Force units in the theater. This again is kind of the concluding part of Kwang Chi-man's article, where he's kind of noting this full transformation from this pie in the sky stuff to we're going to just do some interdiction and
Hmm.
defend our airspace. Um, Now, I guess I should at least mention the AVG, the Flying
You're,
Tigers, because
you're
it's
you're laughing, Seth. I saw that chuckle
Well,
back
no,
there.
I'm just saying what he said about the Chinese, like how they evolved in
Right.
terms of what they were able to do or what they wanted to do, and
Yeah.
what they could do is it's like, I say it all the time. You focus on what you can control, and you do what you can do to the best of your ability. And in some
Yeah.
cases that's good, in some cases that's not. And it's, I find it interesting. And we started to talk about this earlier in this conversation, and we kind of wiggled down the road, but the way that the Japanese, more so even than the Chinese, because as you said, Justin, the Chinese are forced to hang back and hold back
Hmm.
for multitude of reasons, but the way that the Japanese learn, and it's just it's huge. And this goes back, and I wanted to say something before, and I got sidetracked. Is we're talking about the Western outlook at different things, and I find it very difficult to believe that there were certain things that didn't come out of China as the Japanese are evolving their strategic air campaign, which is what it is, specifically over Chongqing, that didn't make its way into Western
Doctrine.
doctrinal, yeah,
Thought. Yeah.
theory. Because even though we might not have wanted to admit it, because we're far better than they ever could possibly be,
Yes.
that we're watching this go down, and everything that we're basing our, and by we I'm talking about United States, are basing our doctrine on is theory, not practice. Theory. And
Yeah.
here's the practice. They also had a doctrine that they had to hone and refine and shape and mold and all this other jazz, and they've come out with a pretty damn good product for what they have, for what they're able to do. And you cannot, I find it very difficult to believe that, whomever Ira Eaker didn't sit there and read these reports and go,
We might need long range fighter escorts.
yeah, this might be a good idea to
Yeah.
start working on some of these things,
Yeah.
and again, admission is one thing, and actual adoption is another. And I think,
Right.
I think it played a lot heavier into the way that we, the United States, and the Brits, and the Germans too, for that matter, started to adopt things. Because if you just look at the way the air war changes, especially for the United States over Europe in 1942, into 1943, and then obviously in 44, it's a clear
Complete
case of,
transformation.
yeah,
Yeah.
same kind of things going on in China,
Right.
and there's a reason
Could have
for it.
learned that lesson right off the bat that, yeah, we need a fighter that has drop tanks. And yeah, that's a whole other thing. Anyway. Okay. So
Sorry.
the Chinese, by God, now can at least do interdiction and can contest, it sounds like, local airspace. Yeah.
Yep, yep. So the kind of it's the theme from 41 to 45 is just gradually increasing Allied air strength. And on the flip side, the Japanese Army Air Service has kind of been left alone. Their air
Yeah.
sway, and then they're even within the Japanese Army Air Service, their air strength in China starts to degrade over time because where are you going to go turn to when, the gaping maw of the South Pacific or other
Yeah.
theaters, you start pulling units, you start pulling experienced personnel.
That
Um,
becomes the Army's air war.
yeah, and
Yeah.
the so the again rough figures I have is after the Japanese Navy Air Service withdrawal from China, there were about 300 aircraft left in theater.
Hmm.
Um, and then this had shrunk to around 230 by the beginning of 1944. And again,
Okay.
you can see wild variance here. I've seen figures as low as 100 by the start of 1944. That there could be something there
Is,
with between operational and
is that
not.
Navy and Army,
That'd be
Japanese
Navy and
Navy?
Army combined, but almost entirely Army
Okay.
by this
That they've
point.
only got 200 planes left in this country, whereas we started this air war off with roughly 1,000.
Yeah, yeah, like or between
Okay.
the two, like even at the earliest operations, like you're looking at what, like a little shy of 400, like
Yeah,
ready to
right.
go for operations. So yeah, and of course the flip side of that is Chinese and American air strength had kind of built up increasing
Yeah.
superiority. So they had, against, let's say, 230 roughly Japanese aircraft, they had about 300 operational on the Allied side by the start of 1944, rising to about 700 to 800 by the end of 1944. And then the
Wow.
Japanese were down to maybe about 150 by the end of that year. Um,
The
so it's
worm has
kind of
turned.
it's one of those aspects of the war where it wasn't the decisive, war winning part of the air war when you're looking
Sure.
at the wider Asia Pacific war. It kind of follows that same loop though of gradual ramp up of Allied strength while the Japanese degrade for
Yeah.
one reason or another, to the point where by the end the Japanese are, I was just
Totally
rereading that
outclassed.
monograph, and they're like, they had instructions to just do not engage Allied fighters,
Mhm.
only attack if everything looks really favorable, and we're just kind of coping
Yeah.
to the
Yeah,
end.
that's
One
what
of
we
the
were saying over
Chinese
Japan
Air
in
Force.
45, same kind of thing.
Yeah. What's the Chinese Air Force flying at that point in terms of airframes?
Almost pretty much entirely American. So P-40,
Tomahawks and
yeah, B-25s are the two big ones.
okay.
They do start getting some P-51 cast-offs, like as newer models of the P-51 start coming in, and the
Hmm.
US get the whatever the shiny new one is, and then the Chinese would get like Bs and stuff like that.
Right.
Um, so kind of like a smattering of it was pretty much an all-American Air
Yeah.
Force, mainly because their existing inventory, like the Soviet stuff and everything, had pretty much been
That's all gone.
destroyed or retired.
Sure. Sure. That makes
So
sense.
yeah, um, and that's kind of the quick rundown there. Again, to go back to the AVG really quickly, because I know like AVG is like linked to the air war in China,
Mhm.
when in pure factual terms they're not so relevant.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
the AVG was formed technically before the declaration of war.
Right.
I stupidly didn't write down the date. Was it like July 1st, 1941 that they were authorized? Something
It was
like that.
before Pearl Harbor, but they don't get into
Yeah.
theater until
Yeah, exactly. So they're obviously they're training, they're getting volunteers, they're
right.
getting
Yep.
people in position. And their combat debut is like December 23rd,
Hmm.
1941, and it's in
Yep.
Burma. And
In
then that's
Burma.
where they do
Yep.
the bulk of their work. And they are probably among, if not the most successful Allied fighter unit,
Yep.
pardon me, in the initial part of the war. They aren't quite as successful as their legend, but I mean they're
Right.
25 feet tall in the legend of the
Sure.
Flying Tigers, but they still perform quite well. Um, and then of course they're eventually rolled into the wider war effort from there. Obviously, there's a lot we could talk about with that, but that's kind of
Yeah.
their. I wanted to underline that because it's quite common in like comments and when I talk to people online that there's just an assumption that the AVG was this thing that was like in China for years before the
Right.
war and like doing
Yeah.
all this
Huge
fighting. And
misconception.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know
Huge.
how that happened other than just people hear that there was a unit authorized before the war and they
Right.
went to China. And
Yeah.
I think the imagination takes over from there. But
Right. Right.
yeah.
Well, we
Oh.
have definitely done our done our normal long-winded thing today. Yes. Anything
Yeah.
else we want to cover before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, I could talk for another 3 hours about all of the lessons learned. Um, yeah, the
Well,
lessons
like
were good and bad. That's what I can
yes.
say.
Yeah.
I would say predominantly good would be my
Hmm.
argument, with
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
bad in there. Um,
Yeah.
but, yeah.
Well, I've definitely got some questions about the behavior of their air forces, both in Malaya and the Philippines campaign, but I'm going to save that for another time. So, yeah, we should wrap this puppy because it's long.
Tis. But yeah, we
Justin,
definitely want to go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much for spending the time and hanging out with us today. This was really really fun, and I've been
Oh,
looking
yeah.
forward to it for a while. So, and this is where I shamelessly pile on it. When are you going to get done with your book? Because
Oh
I'm gonna,
God. We'll see.
thank God,
At
you
some point
jerk.
before the heat death of the universe, we'll see.
Okay, that sounds fair.
Yeah,
So,
we'll see what I want to do with that. But
yeah,
I'm
good enough.
crawling along.
Right. It's the problem of having these pesky day jobs when you should be spending your time writing history.
Yeah.
I know that one well. So
Yeah.
Mm.
anyway, Seth, you good?
Yeah, I'm good. I was going to say I'm glad you came aboard, and we're definitely want to have you back to talk about the air war over the Solomons because that in and of itself is a 2 or 3 episode
Mm.
And there's a
beast.
lot of new
Epic story.
scholarship on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
anyway,
That's I mean I think that's everybody just assumes that a lot of Japanese pilots died there, and which obviously they did, and I don't think the significance of the attritional aspect of that particular air campaign is fully understood
right.
because
And
that
how
was a
long the
bloodbath.
Japanese actually hung in there too.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, yeah, we can
And the
save that
consequences of those losses, but we can talk about that
another
another
time
time, another time
over popcorn. So
over over beer or whiskey
okay,
or beer and
even
whiskey.
better. All
It's
right,
always
man.
better. All
Give
right,
us
well,
the
let's
wrap
wrap this
up.
sucker up. Yep, let's do it. All
Yep.
right, so we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review if you choose to do so. If you have a comment only, send it to unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Finally catching up on the emails. Don't ask me any questions, guys. I'm not going to answer them. I'm sorry. I just don't have the time. Save
Yep.
them for the Q&A. That being said, thank you much for listening and or watching. My name is Seth Paridon, and I want to thank you, as always, my good buddy John, for being here with us. Justin, thank you very much for being with us
Thank you, Justin.
today,
Really appreciate it.
and we hope to have you back soon. John, let's go.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for hanging out with us today, and we will see you all again next week.